Hello everybody, I'm the White Angel and I am a conservative. Today, I'm going to be covering part 2 of the Pillars of Western Civilization. That will be a lengthy playlist. But today I'm addressing the Greek philosophy portion. I'll be right back. Hold on a second. Anyway, the Greek philosophy portion, we'll be looking at that. That is the first pillar of Western civilization. And it actually informs pretty much all thinking of a Western origin or Western nature. What philosophy is essentially, it is a school of thought. It is the method by which civilizations used to gain knowledge about the world before science. It's the OG. This was our primary means of understanding. It had a very simple investigative method, which in modern times is called natural philosophy, where you either went for a walk or sat under a tree and just watched things around you and thought, what's up with that? Why is that happening? What's going on there? What is that? That is the basic methodology of philosophy, is simple questions, thought experiments, etc., which determine much of Western thought. Philosophy is the beginning for all civilizations, in fact. There's Eastern schools of thought, which are very, very different. But this is really where the West gets its thinking from. It's primarily from the Near East, which, while not technically part of the West, the cultural influence is extremely impossible to deny. Anyway, we begin with the pre-Socratic thought. This is prior to the man who invented the term in the West, Socrates. Now, pre-Socratic thought. It is important to note that pre-Socratic philosophy comes down to us in scattered quotes of thinkers such as Anaxagoras, and these quotes are fragmentary and held within third-party references. These philosophers never used the term philosophy, and most were actually contemporary to Socrates, hence why the term is hotly contested. So they were largely contemporaries, but the pre-Socratic thinkers, generally speaking, are the most scientific or perhaps pre-scientific, sort of a kind of pre-science. Take, for example, the Milesians, which is Thales, and Thales is the first known philosophy recorded. He proposed a first principle of the cosmos, i.e. water. Now, what we know of Thales is referenced by Aristotle, and Aristotle conjectured as to Thales' work. But he suggested that all things derive nourishment from water, and the next heat comes to carry with it some kind of nourishment of moisture, and finally the seeds of living things have some fundamental moisture, making water the source of growth for many moist and living things. What is interesting is the lack of evidence in his testimony. They lack evidence that Thales postulated any such thing. It seems more likely that Thales postulated water as a primal source of all things, perhaps the sine qua non of the world. Now, I'm not sure what exactly that term means, but just the primary source of the world, which is also present in Islamic lore. Born of elements and such in Islam. Now, much like Thales, there was this dude called Anaximander who posited a source for the cosmos. He called this thing boundless, or apeiron. Unlike Thales, Anaximander moved beyond the elements, like water and earth, and postulated something more elusive than any readily available thing. Anaximander's boundless is theorized to have made the universe from a separation gathering of hotness and coldness. And the universe itself is a conglomerating of elements, separating, combining like poetry in motion. This is essentially the first attempt in recorded history at a secular God model. Like the God of Spinoza, the Spinoza model, the IEP God, a secular God model. Secular but relatively theistic. The boundless is also said to be the source of all things, and to which all things return at a justly decided time. if the dates are correct, Anaximenes could have no contact with Anaximander. Yet aside from their similar names, their ideas were similar and is rather uncanny. They both suggested an underlying boundless force that made all things. For Anaximander, the boundless generated a separation of hot and cold that generated all other things, after the fact. But for Anaximenes, air itself becomes other things with condensation and rarefaction. Rarefied air becomes fire. When it is condensed, it becomes water, and when it is condensed further, it becomes earth and other solid objects. This, according to Anaximenes, gave rise to life forms, and air itself was divine. According to Cicero and Aelius, for Anaximenes, air is God, and it is from the air we have all things. So you see that this is a kind of a pseudo-scientific or a pre-scientific sort of thing, a pre-Socratic thought. We do get to some more genuinely scientific things like studies of motion and time and such. But we move on to the importance of Xenophanes. He's very important to Greek theology. He challenged the myths and legends of Homeric and Hesiodic thought, the tenets of which state that gods are to be held in high esteem, rather than portraying them in raging battles which are worthless. Homer and Hesiod had attributed to the gods all the foul traits of flawed and deceitful human beings, according to Xenophanes. Theft, adultery, rape, etc. This is a kind of anthropomorphization of a divine force. And he thought this was idiotic and even somewhat profane. So Xenophanes would be the first, I guess you could say, pagan theologian. So he has a certain importance to theology, mostly in Greek, but possibly also in general. That maybe he's correct, we shouldn't be anthropomorphizing deities if we can help it. With the exceptions of certain figures like Jesus, who is supposed to be both God and man simultaneously. So in his case, it's fine. But in many other cases, it probably should not be done. But then again, what other way do we have to depict gods? I mean, it's kind of those damned if you do, damned if you don't sort of things. But he has a fine point. Then, of course, we have Pythagoras, who spent much of his time in Egypt. He was important philosophical mathematician who solved the equation that the square of the hypotenuse of a right triangle is equal to the sum of the squares of the adjacent sides. Now, there is some dispute and debate over whether or not Pythagoras either invented the problem or brought it with him from Egypt, which is certainly possible. Egypt was equal to Greece, if not greater, in its level of learning and education. It rivaled Greece, if not surpassed Greece. That's an important thing to admit. Egypt was very up there, and there's probably some cross-infection, some Greek thinkers, some Egyptian thinkers. He still solved the damn thing regardless. So he made a major advancement in mathematics, similar to the advancements made by some of the Arab philosophers, both pre- and post-Islamic. Now, what's interesting is that the Pythagoreans were a kind of cult of a sort, and they believed in the transmigration of the soul, and the full complete cycle would be over 3,000 years in time before returning to a human being. And according to one story, Pythagoras saw the beating of an innocent puppy and screamed for them to stop, because he recognized the soul of a friend in the howling. Now, regardless of whether or not it was actually a reincarnated person, this is obviously intensely cruel to simply beat a howling puppy. Like, this is unthinkable. This is disgusting behavior, truly. No sensitivity to the poor thing's pain at all. But Plato and Aristotle, who did most of the recording of these early pre-Socratic thinkers, in fact, Plato and Aristotle are basically the two most important Greek philosophers. We'll get to them after a while. But they had a tendency to associate the holiness and wisdom of numbers, and along with this, harmony and music, with the Pythagoreans. The mathematical-based beliefs of the Pythagoreans led them to see the universe as being infinite and without limit, and this extended the knowledge and imagines if nothing, we are limited, but matter were just an enormous heap. Now suppose you could perceive that heap to do so. There must be a limit that gives you the ability. All known things have number, which functions as a limit of things, insofar as each thing is a unity of composed of a plurality of parts. Tripping over my own words slightly. These are from my notes. I was studying quite intensely for this. I mean to do this entire series on the Pillars of Western Civilization. I'm going to teach you all something. So you listen. You listen good. Now Heraclitus sends out it as a unique philosopher who saw the universe as a grand contradiction. And its state of constant change was what it at rest. He communicated this through ambiguous wordplay and poetry. In Heraclitus' vision of the cosmos, fire plays a major role. The universe always was and always will be, according to Heraclitus. Fire is, according to Heraclitus, the element from which all comes and all will return. He uses fire as a kind of metaphor for need and satiety. It's possible that he does not mean literal fire, but a metaphorical fire, something that operates on a similar logical principle to fire. A hunger which is satisfied, creating tension and distension, being characteristic of life and reality. Heraclitus sees contrast and contradiction like war and peace, or up and down as a necessity, and that up road and down road as the same road in the end. Thus his mouthpiece of Critolus, Heraclitus states that you cannot step into the same river twice, because reality is in a state of constant flux. According to Aristotle, this revelation led Critolus to the extreme fear of speaking, as the words might freeze a reality that is in constant flux. In essence, through tension and distension of time and becoming, the river is what it is by being what it is not. The fire of the cosmos is at constant war with itself and yet at peace, constantly wanting fuel to keep burning, and yet it burns and is satisfied. This does hit up on some certain fundamental truths, but it doesn't quite reach the exact nature of the universe, but it's a really good first start for a civilization this early in time. Now here's where we get to the part of pre-Socratic thought that is more genuinely scientific, and that is Zeno, or Zeno, depending on how you say it. That depends on your accent, I suppose. But Parmenides is said to be the creator of metaphysics, who saw the universe as a kind of stillness. He was pivotal in pre-Socratic thought. Most of his work is communicated through poetry, but is fueled by logic, and it sparked thinking on the issue of nature of being and thinking. According to Parmenides, the right way to... hold on a sec. There we go. The right way to think is what is, and the wrong way to think is what is and what is not. And it is the daily sensations of feeling that mislead us into thinking of what is not. Thinking and being are the same, according to Parmenides. We erroneously believe that we see, hear, touch, and smell are the truth. But if non-being is not, then change is impossible. When anything changes, it moves from non-being to being. For being to grow tall, it must have at some point been not tall. Since not being is not and cannot therefore be thought, we are deluded into believing that this sort of change actually happens. Similarly, what is one. If there were a plurality, there would be non-being. Parmenides, through this, argues we must trust in reason alone. In this philosopher's tradition, we have Zeno, as Daniel Graham says, while Parmenides argues for monism, Zeno argues against pluralism. Zeno seems to have composed a text where he claims to show the absurdity of accepting a plurality of beings, and he also shows that motion is impossible. Zeno shows that if we attempt to count a plurality, we end up with an absurdity. If there were a plurality, the number would be infinite because there is always something else between existing things, and something else between those ad infinitum. If there were a plurality of things, then that plurality would be both infinite and finite in number, which is absurd. The most enduring paradoxes are those concerning the idea of motion. It is impossible for a body in motion to traverse a distance of 20 feet. In order to do so, the body must arrive at the halfway point, or 10 feet. But in order to arrive there, the body in motion must travel 2.5 feet ad infinitum. Since then, space is infinitely divisible, but we have only finite time to traverse it. It cannot be done. Presumably, one could not even begin a journey at all. The Achilles paradox similarly attacks motion, saying that swift-footed Achilles will never be able to catch up with the slow runner, assuming the runner started at some point ahead of Achilles. Achilles must first reach the place where the slow runner began. This means that the slow runner will already be a bit beyond where he began. Once Achilles progresses to the next place, the slow runner is already beyond that point too. Thus, motion seems absurd. But absurdities happen all the time. We see absurd things occur all at once, simply because we cannot calculate it. I think Zeno's greatest mistake was thinking that just because something is absurd means it could not exist. Plenty of things which are absurd can't exist. We can observe the... But anyway, I'm digressing a little bit from the point. We see the beginning of his thought, and I don't currently have the means to really challenge his conclusion at the moment. Maybe I'll do a video on that where I attack Zeno. I'll do some educational stuff. I'm not going to be all politics, dude. I'm going to do a little bit of everything. But we have a few other thinkers. We have Anaxagoras, who left a huge impression on Plato and Aristotle. Although they were both ultimately dissatisfied with his cosmology, he seems to have been exclusively concerned with cosmology and the true nature of all that is around us. Before the cosmos was the way it is now, it was a great mixture with everything and everything. The mixture was so thoroughgoing that no part of it was recognizable due to the smallness of each thing. Anaxagoras thought that the matter was infinitely divisible. That is because it is impossible for being not to be there is never a smallest part. If the parts of the great mixture were not infinitely divisible, then we would be left with a smallest part. Since the smallest part could not become smaller, any attempt at dividing it again would presumably obliterate it. The most important thing in the continuing existence is mind. Although mind can be in some things, nothing else can be in it. For Anaxagoras, everything is mixed with everything. There is some portion of everything in anything that we identify. Thus, if anything were mixed with mind, then everything would be mixed with mind. This mixture would obstruct mind's ability to rule all else. Mind is in control and is responsible for the mixture of being. Everlasting mind is responsible for ordering the world. This sort of references the Roman philosopher Plutarch, and it does have a definite truth behind it. It's a little strange, but he's basically saying that the world of perceptions and the world of physical things are the same thing. They're not, but it is true that without the mind there can be no organizing of the world of perceived things. So we're looking at a kind of pre- or proto-psychology here. Very important, we see. Now, here we get into Democritus and atomism. Now, atomism began as a legacy in philosophical and scientific thought, and this legacy was revived and significantly evolved in modern philosophy. Today, the atom is not the smallest bit of matter. In fact, if we keep looking for a smallest bit of matter, we just end up finding an even smaller bit of matter than that. Muons and electrons and so forth. And we just keep going and going and going. It's basically we have an infinite regress of smaller and smaller bits. But Leucippus and Democritus were concerned with the smallest particles in nature that make up reality. Particles that are both invisible and indivisible. To some extent, they were responding to Parmenides and Zeno. Atoms are infinite in number, according to them, and move through an infinite void. In fact, motion would be impossible, according to Democritus, without said void. Atoms come in all shapes and sizes and smashing into one another to form reality. Some are jagged, some are round, some are square, and so forth. Once joined, atoms stay together until some force breaks them apart, at which point they resume their constant motion. Why certain atoms come together and form the world seems random, and yet many worlds have been, are and will be formed by atomic collision and coalescence. Once a world is formed, however, all things happen by necessity. The causal law of nature dictate the course of the natural universe. Now, here's the coolest dudes in pre-Socratic thought, my friends. Here are the coolest dudes ever. The Sophists. Sophistry is mostly related to us through Plato, who tells us in his dialogues that Protagoras and Gorgias, named for two famous sophists, as well as a work simply called The Sophists Beyond the Elements of Sophistry, are replete throughout Plato's work. In essence, being the source of similarities between Socrates and Sophists. Thus, the Sophists had significant influence on the 5th century Greece and philosophy. The Sophists were itinerant teachers who would charge fees, I should say, to teach in a variety of subjects with rhetoric as the primary subject in their teaching. They would argue for opposing views, as well as their own views. Thus, these arguments and rhetorical skills were useful both in politics and in court. Many, however, saw these practices as a sign of moral and epistemological relativism, which for one was tantamount to intellectual fraud. One sign of moral and epistemological relativism, which, one of the first and possible most famous sophist was Protagoras. There are only fragments of his work, however. The rest is found in Plato's dialogue, and should be read cautiously. He is most famous for the statement, "Human beings are the measure of all things, of things that are they are, of things they are that they are not." Plato, for the purposes of the Protagoras, read individual relativism, one of the statement, an example of the, if the pool of water feels cold to Henry, then it is cold for Henry, while it may appear warm for Jennifer. So be warm for Jennifer. This example portrays perceptual relativism, but the same could be said for ethics as well. That is, if X seems good to Henry, then it is good for Henry, but maybe not for someone else. You see the point. Sophists were basically relativists, but they were arguing from an angle that brought new understanding to the older ways of thinking. That is the beauty of sophistry. These dudes would argue for both sides of the argument, they would invent new terms, and they would take everything from a brand new angle to further the understanding. Was it maybe a little dishonest and maybe a little shifty? Sure, but important nonetheless. People engage in sophistry all the time. It's called playing the devil's advocate. And if you invent new terms for your ideology, that is also sophistry. It has its place and is not necessarily to be suspected or suspicious as some kind of amorphous devilry. So, suffice to say, it is important to thinking in general. Important for debating, study, etc. So now we move on to the big three of Greek philosophy. These are my boys: Socrates, Aristotle, and Plato. How dare the Sicilian from The Princess Bride say that they were all idiots? Pfft. Bastard! May the dread pirate Roberts thrust his sword upon thee. Anyway, Socrates basically wrote nothing down. All of his stories and information are related to us through Plato and a dude called Xenophon. Not to be confused with Xenophanes. And that's spelled with an X, by the way. So, that's very confusing. Thank you, Greece. Thank you. But Plato both knew Socrates and wrote dialogues featuring him as the main character. However, some of their histories are incompatible. We cannot be certain Plato or Xenophon are reporting accurately on Socrates. In some cases, we can be sure that they are intentionally not misrepresenting Socrates, rather using him as a mouthpiece to further dialogue on philosophy. Xenophon wrote some biographical information on Socrates in his Memorabilia, but there is no way of knowing how much is accurate. When we mention Socrates, we are typically referring to the character of Socrates, usually Plato's version. He was the son of Sophroniscus, a carpenter, and was born an Athenian citizen. He reportedly had a gift with words and was often accused of what he would later accuse the Sophists of. which is using rhetorical devices to make the weaker argument the stronger. In reference to Socrates' use of rhetoric, Xenophon writes that the 30 tyrants forbade Socrates from public speaking except on matters of practical business, as they felt that he was leading the young astray. With his clever use of words, Aristophanes presents Socrates as an impoverished sophist whose head was in the clouds to the detriment of his daily life. His similarities to the sophists were highlighted even in Plato's work. Indeed, Socrates' courtroom speech in Plato's Apology includes a defense against accusations of sophistry. While Xenophon and Plato both recognize this rhetorical Socrates, they both present Socrates as a virtuous man who used his skills in argumentation for truth, or at least to help remove himself and his interlocutors from error. The so-called Socratic method, or elenkos, refers to the way in which Socrates often carried out his philosophical practice, a method to which he seems to refer in Plato's Apology. Socrates aims to expose errors or inconsistencies in his interlocutors' positions. He did so by asking them questions, often demanding yes or no answers, and then reduce their positions to absurdity. He was, in short, aiming for interlocutor to admit his own ignorance, especially where the interlocutor thought that he knew what he did not in fact know. Thus, many Platonic dialogues end in aporia, an impasse in thought, a place of perplexity about the topic originally under discussion. This presumably the place from which a thoughtful person can then make a fresh start on the way to seeking truth. Socrates practiced philosophy openly and did not charge fees for doing so, and allowed anyone who wanted to engage with him to do so, according to Xenophon. Now, Socrates apparently lived in the open, for early in the morning he went to the public promenades and training ground in the Forum. So he would basically just teach in public. He would mostly teach in public, on street corners, in public gathering halls. And his criticisms of others got him into trouble. His argumentation got him into trouble. People found him offensive. People found him ridiculous. And people thought he was leading the youth astray. And this ended up leading to him being arrested, jailed. And when he was jailed, ironically, his ethics led him to remain in jail. He chose to remain and to face judgment because he thought escaping was immoral and unethical. And on some level that would be correct, though I think the greater evil would be being judged unfairly or being persecuted for a crime he did not commit, which in this case is the truth. Socrates goes down in history in the same category as someone like Jesus, or the historical Jesus, being persecuted for statements that made him unpopular. Made him woefully unpopular. Not to compare a mere mortal to Jesus for you Christians out there, of which I am not, but it's the same general idea. But he claims to have ventured down the path of philosophy because of a proclamation from the oracle at Delphi. Socrates' enthusiastic followers Chaerephon reportedly visited the oracle at Delphi to ask the god present there, whether anyone among the Athenians was wiser than Socrates. The god replied that no one was wiser than Socrates. Socrates, who claims never been wise, wondered what this meant. So in order just to understand better the god's claim, Socrates questioned Athenians from all social strata about their wisdom in Plato's Apology. Socrates claims that most people he questioned claimed to know what they did not in fact know. As a result of showing so many people their own ignorance, or at least trying to, Socrates became unpopular. This unpopularity eventually is what killed him. Exposing ignorance, making criticisms, you name it. He was so humble he didn't consider himself wise. He considered himself wise insofar that he knew what he did not know. We see the kind of humility that this man had, and insisted that others should have. In the end, Socrates was a victim of a corrupt state, and indeed did not deserve his fate, and he was not even remotely guilty of what people accused him of. He was a teacher, trying to open people's minds, and for that he was killed, because the people in power always fear the truth. It's important to remember. Now we move on to Plato. Plato is very relevant to modern politics, and in general, he eventually created the idea of the republic, albeit the modern version of a republican system is not quite what he'd originally conceived of. His version is very different, and we'll see that in a minute. But Plato was the son of Athenian aristocrats. He grew up in a time of upheaval in Athens, especially at the conclusion of the Peloponnesian War, when Athens was conquered by Sparta. Deborah Nail says that Plato would have been 12 when Athens lost her empire with the revolt of the subject allies, 13 when democracy fell briefly to the oligarchy of 400, and 14 when democracy was restored. We cannot be sure of when he met Socrates, although ancient sources suggest he became Socrates' follower at 18. He might have met Socrates, he might have not met Socrates earlier, though the relationship between Socrates and Plato's uncle Charmides, I should not have said not. He could have met him earlier than when they think, but he definitely met him. In 431 BCE, he might have known Socrates too, though his musical education, which would have consisted of anything under the purview of the muses, that is everything from dancing to reading, writing, and arithmetic. So music was a much broader category in ancient Greece. He also seems to have spent some time with Cratylus, the Heraclitean, which probably had an impact primarily on his metaphysics and epistemology. Plato had aspirations for the political life. Several untoward events pushed him away from the life of political leadership, but not the least of which was Socrates' trial and conviction. While the authenticity of Plato's seventh letter is debated among scholars, it might give us some insight into Plato's biography. Now here's a quote. At last I came to the conclusion that all existing states are badly governed, and the condition of their laws practically incurable without some miraculous remedy and the assistance of fortune, and I was forced to say, in praise of true philosophy, that from her height alone was it possible to discern what the nature of justice is, either in the state or in the individual, that the ills of the human race would never end, either those who are sincerely and truly lovers of wisdom come into political power, or the rulers of our cities, by the grace of gods, learn true philosophy. Plato saw any political regime without the aid of philosophy or fortune as fundamentally corrupt. This attitude, however, did not turn Plato entirely from politics. He visited Sicily 3 times, where 2 of these trips were failed attempts at trying to turn the tyrant Dionysius II to the life of philosophy. He thus returned to Athens and focused his efforts on the philosophical education he had begun at his academy. Now, since Plato wrote dialogues, there is a fundamental difficulty with any effort to identify just what Plato himself had thought. Plato never appears in any of the dialogues as an interlocutor. If he was voicing any of his own thoughts, he did it through the mouthpiece of particular characters in the dialogues, each of which has a particular historical context. Thus, any pronouncement of Plato's theory of this or that must be tentative at best. Now, Plato's metaphysics, perhaps the most famous of Plato's metaphysical concepts to his notion of the so-called forms or ideas. The Greek words that we translate as form or idea are eidos or eidos and idea. Both of these words are rooted in verbs of seeing. Thus, the eidos of something is its look, shape, or form. But as many philosophers do, Plato manipulates this word and has to refer to immaterial entities. Why is it that one can recognize that a maple tree is a tree, an oak is a tree, and a Japanese fir is a tree? What is that unites all of our concepts of various trees under a unitary category of tree? It is the form of tree that allows us to understand anything about each and every tree, but Plato does not stop there. The forms can be interpreted not only as purely theoretical entities, but also as immaterial entities that give being to material entities. Each tree, for example, is what it is insofar as it participates in the form of tree. Each human being, for example, is different from the next, but each human being is human to the extent that she participates in the form of human being. This material-immaterial emphasis seems directed ultimately towards Plato's epistemology. That is, if anything can be known, it is the forms. Since things in the world are changing and temporal, we cannot know them. Therefore, forms are unchanging and eternal beings that give being to all changing and temporal beings in the world. If knowledge is to be certain and clear, in other words, we cannot know something that is different from one moment to the next. Forms are therefore pure ideas that unify and stabilize the multiplicity of changing beings in the material world. The forms are ultimate reality, and this is shown to us in the allegory of the cave. Now, the allegory of the cave is a story where we have a group of prisoners who are unaware of their status as prisoners. They are chained in such a way that they cannot turn their heads. They can only stare upon the wall in front of them. And upon the wall there are lights, there are shadows cast via light. These shadows are the things of objects being pushed and pulled in front of a flame, creating an illusory reality. Now, suppose one of these prisoners is released and then comes out to the surface of the cave and sees the real world. And initially it's too harsh to him. The sun is too bright, the grass is too green, everything's so intense and so bright. This is an obvious metaphor for the nature of the truth when you see it for the first time. It's harsh, it's ugly, it's not what you were born into, you don't expect it. You try to go back to your former reality, but you realize you can't. Your eyes have been opened, they have been exposed, you can't do it. You've been brought out of the cave is now unlivable. Not only that, the former residents of the cave laugh at you and mock you mercilessly for ever leaving. So you just embrace reality and move on. Let the fools live in their cave. Now, we can see the process of education. At first, the prisoner sees the fire, which casts the shadows he formerly took to be reality. He is then led out of the cave to see the truth. The concept of the forms, however, is criticized in Plato's Parmenides. This dialogue shows us a young Socrates whose understanding of the forms is being challenged by Parmenides. Parmenides first challenged the young Socrates about the scope of the forms. It seems absurd, thinks Parmenides, to suppose stones, hair, or bits of dirt of their own form. He then presents the famous third man argument. The forms are supposed to be unitary. The multiplicity of large material things, for example, participate in the one form of largeness, which itself does not participate in anything else. Parmenides argues this unity, so another form of largeness will make its appearance, which has emerged alongside largeness itself, and the things that partake of it, and in turn another over all these, by which all of them will be large. Each of the forms will no longer be one, but limited in multitude. In other words, it is the form of largeness, itself large, if so, it would need to participate in another form of largeness, which itself would need to participate in another form, and so forth. In short, we can see that Plato is tentative about what is now considered his most important theory. Indeed, in his 7th letter, Plato says that talking about the forms at all is a difficult matter. These things, because of weakness of the language, are just as much concerned with making clear that the particular property of each object is the being of it. On this account, sensible man will venture to express his deepest thoughts in words, especially in a form which is unchangeable, as is true of written outlines. The forms are beyond words, or at best words can only approximately reveal the truth of the forms. Yet Plato seems to take it on faith that if there is knowledge to be had, there must be these unchanging eternal beings. So the essential claim remains, but the nature of the claim changes. He's feeling as though his theory was initially incorrect. He is criticizing himself, which is good. This is how we advance the conversation. Now, in Plato's epistemology, we can say that for Plato, if there is to be knowledge, it must be eternal, unchanging things. The world is constantly in flux. It is therefore strange to say that one has knowledge of it, when one can also claim to have knowledge of, say, arithmetic or geometry, which are stable, unchanging things. According to Plato, that is, it seems absurd that one's ideas about changing things are on a par with one's ideas about unchanging things. Moreover, like Cratylus, we must wonder whether ideas about the changing world are ever accurate at all. Our ideas, after all, tend to be much like a photograph of a world. But unlike the photograph, the world continues to change. Thus, Plato reserves the forms as those things about which we can have true knowledge. How we get knowledge is difficult. The problem of acquiring knowledge gave rise to Meno's paradox in Plato's Meno. In their search for the nature of virtue, Meno asked Socrates, "How will you look for virtue, Socrates, when you do not know at all what it is? How will you aim to search for something you do not know at all? If you meet with it, how will you know that this is the thing that you did not know? If one wants to know X, this implies that he, she does not know X now. If so, then it seems that one cannot even begin to ask about X. In other words, it seems that one must already know X in order to ask about X in the first place. But if we already know X, then there's nothing to ask. Even if one could ask one what would not know when he, she has the answer, since one did not know what he, she was looking for in the first place." Socrates answers the debater's argument with the theory of recollection, claiming that he has heard others talk about this divine matter. The theory of recollection rests upon the assumption that the human soul is immortal. The soul's immortality entails, says Socrates, that the soul has been and known all things since it has always been. Somehow the soul forgets these things upon its incarnation, and the task of knowledge is to recollect them. This, of course, is a poor argument. Plato knows this, given his preface that it is a divine matter, and Socrates' insistence that we must believe it rather than the paradox of Meno mentions thus. Socrates famously goes on to show recollection in action through a series of questions posed to Meno's slave. Through a series of leading questions, Meno's slave provides the answer to a geometrical problem that he did not previously know, or more precisely, he recollects knowledge that he had previously forgotten. So yeah, that's sort of the nature of his epistemology, which informs actually a lot of what we understand of the idea of knowledge. The idea of knowledge itself is very much formed by Plato. So he quite very much built the notion itself. Now, what's interesting is Plato's psychology and how closely it gets to truly describing the very basic nature of human behavior. He is famous for his theory of the tripartite soul, which he makes no distinction between soul and consciousness, by the way. The most thorough formulation of which is in the Republic. The soul is at least logically, if not also ontologically, divided into three parts: reason, spirit, and appetite, which he calls logos, thumos, and epithumia. Reason is responsible for rational thought and will be in control of the most ordered soul. Spirit is responsible for spirited emotions like anger. Appetites are responsible not only for natural appetites such as hunger, thirst, and sex, but also for the desire of excess in each of these and other appetites. Why are three separate according to Plato? The argument for the distinction between three parts of the soul rests upon the principle of contradiction. Socrates says it is obvious that the same thing will not be willing to do or undergo opposites in the same part of itself, in relation to the same thing at the same time. So if we ever find this happening in the soul, we'll know that we aren't dealing with one thing but many. Thus, for example, the appetitive part of the soul is responsible for someone's thirst. Just because, however, that a person might desire a drink, it does not mean she will drink at the time. In fact, it is conceivable that for whatever reason she will restrain herself from drinking at the time. Since the principle of contradiction entails that the same part of the soul cannot, at the same time, and the same respect not desire to drink, it must be some other part of the soul that helps rein in the desire. The rational part of the soul is responsible for keeping desire in check. Or so in case just mentioned, denying the fulfillment of desires when it is appropriate to do so. Why does the spirited part differ from the appetitive part? To answer this question, Socrates relates a story he once heard about a man named Leontius, I should say, was going up from the Piraeus along the outside of the north wall when he saw corpses lying on the executioner's feet. He had an appetite to look at them, but at the same time he was disgusted and turned away. Despite his disgust with his desire, Leontius reluctantly looked at the corpses. Socrates also cites examples when someone has done something on account of appetite for which he later reproaches himself. The reproach is rooted in an alliance between reason and spirit. Reason knows that indulgence in the appetite is bad, and spirit on reason's behalf becomes angry. Reason, with the help of spirit, will rule in the best souls. Appetite, and perhaps some degree, spirit will rule in a disordered soul. The life of a philosophy is a cultivation of reason and its rule. The soul is also immortal, and from more than one famous argument for the immortality of the soul comes from the Phaedo. This argument rests upon a theory of the relationship of the opposites. Hot and cold, for example, are opposites, and there are processes of becoming between the two. Hot comes to be what it is from cold. Cold must also come from whatever it is from hot. Otherwise, all things would move in only one direction, so to speak. And everything would therefore be hot. Life and death are also opposites. Living things come to be dead, and death comes from life. But since the process between opposites cannot be one-way affair, life must also come from death. Presumably Plato means by death here the realm of non-earthly existence. So yeah, we see how closely he gets to truly explaining the human nature and behavior in a really in-depth way. This is brilliant stuff. I need a drink of water. This is an educational video, yo. Get with the program. Anyway. So this is his ethics and politics. This is where we get into the differences between our modern Republican conception and his. Now, Plato's psychology intersects with his ethics. The best life is life of philosophy. That is the life of loving and pursuing wisdom. A life spent engaging logos. The philosophical life is also the most excellent life, since it is the touchstone of true virtue. Without wisdom, there is only a shadow or imitation of virtue, and such lives are still dominated by passion, desire, and emotions. On the other hand, the soul of the philosopher achieves a calm from such emotions. It follows reason and ever stays with it contemplating the true divine, which is not the object of opinion. Now, let's see, according to Phaedo, it is the philosopher too who must rule the ideal city. As we saw in Plato's 7th letter, just as the philosopher's soul is ruled by reason, the ideal city must be ruled by the philosophers. The Republic begins with the question of what true justice is. Socrates proposes that he and his interlocutors, Glaucon and Adeimantus, excuse me, there we go again, might see justice more clearly in the individual if they take a look at justice writ large in a city. Assuming that an individual is in some way analogous to a city. So Socrates and his interlocutors theoretically create an ideal city, which has 3 social strata: guardians, auxiliaries, and craftspeople, farmers. The guardians will rule, the auxiliaries will defend the city, and the craftspeople and farmers will produce goods and food for the city. The guardians, as we learn in Book 6, will also be philosophers, since only the wisest should rule. The tripartite city mirrors the tripartite soul. When the guardian philosophers rule properly, and when the other 2 classes do their proper work and do not do or attempt to do work that is not properly their own, the city will be just. Much as the soul is just when reason rules, how is it that auxiliaries and craftspeople can be kept in their own proper position and be prevented from ambitious quest for upward movement? Maintaining social order depends not only upon wise ruling, but also upon the noble lie. The noble lie is a myth that the gods mixed in various metals with the members of the various social strata. The guardians were mixed with gold, the auxiliaries with silver, and the farmers the farmers and craftspeople with iron and bronze. Since the gods intended for such a person to belong to the social class that he/she currently does, it would be an offense to the gods for a member of a social class to attempt to become a member of a different social class. The most salient concern here is that Plato's ideal city quickly begins to sound like a fascistic state. He even seems to recognize that at times. For example, the guardians must not only go through a rigorous training and education regimen, but they must also live a strictly communal life with one another. Having no private property, Adeimantus objects to this, saying that the guardians will be unhappy. Socrates replies that they mean to secure happiness for the whole city, not for each individual. Individuality seems lost in Plato's society. In anticipation that such a city is doomed to failure, Plato has it dissolve but he merely cites discord among the rulers and natural process of becoming as the reason for its devolution. Socrates says it is hard for the city composed in this way to change, but everything that comes into being must decay. Not even a constitution such as this will last forever. It, too, must face dissolution. We may notice here that Plato cites human fragility and finitude as sources of the ideal city's devolution, not the city's possible fascistic tendencies. Yet it is possible that the lust for power is the cause of strife, and discord among the leaders. In other words, perhaps not even the best sort of education and training can keep even the wisest of human rulers free from desire. It is difficult to overlook the sometimes moralistic and fascistic tendencies in Plato's ethical and political thought. Yes, just as he challenged his own metaphysical ideas, he also at times loosened up his ethical and political ideals. In Phaedo, for example, Plato has Phaedo recount the story of Socrates' final days. Phaedo says that he and other friends of Socrates arrived at the prison early, and when they were granted access to Socrates, Xanthippe, Socrates' wife, was already there with their infant son, which means that Xanthippe had been there all night. Socrates, to his own pleasure, rubs his legs after the shackles have been removed, which implies that even philosophers enjoy bodily pleasures. Again, Phaedo says that Socrates had a way of easing the distress of those around him. In this case, the distress of Socrates' imminent death. Phaedo recounts how Socrates eased his pain on that particular day. I happened to be sitting on his right by the couch on a low stool, so that he was sitting well above me. He stroked my head and pressed the hair on the back of my neck, for he was in the habit of playing with my hair at times. Plato, with these dramatic details, is reminding us that even the philosopher is embodied, and at least to some extent enjoys the embodiment, even though reason is to rule above all else. Now we get to the brilliant and ultimately somewhat problematic Aristotle, and we'll see that in a minute. Now, Aristotle was born in Stagirus, which is a Thracian coastal city. He was the son of Nicomachus, the Macedonian court physician, which allowed for a lifelong connection with the court of Macedonia. When he was 17, Aristotle was sent to Athens to study at Plato's academy, which he did for 20 years. After serving as tutor for the young Alexander the Great, Aristotle turned to Athens and started his own school, the Lyceum. Aristotle walked as he lectured, and his followers therefore later became known as the Peripatetics, those who walked around as they learned. So the Lyceum was not a physical school as such. When Alexander died in 323 and the pro-Macedonian government fell in Athens, a strong anti-Macedonian reaction occurred, and Aristotle was accused of impiety. He fled to Athens to the Chalcis, where he died a year later. Unlike Plato, Aristotle wrote treatises, and he was a prolific writer. Indeed, he wrote several treatises on ethics. He wrote on politics. He first codified the rules of logic. He investigated nature and even the parts of animals and his metaphysics in a significant way of theology. His thought, and particularly his physics, reigned supreme in the Western world for centuries after his death. Yeah, in fact, the dude made serious contributions to investigative measure and debate. Still to this day, we use his concept of the syllogism, which is A equals B, B equals C, therefore A equals C. Ergo, I have never seen a cat fail to land on its feet. A cat can self-right in the air. Ergo, cats will land on their feet. This means that the first statement and the second statement cannot contradict, and the middle statement must be complementary to either one or both. We use this even now. It is a brilliant way to determine whether or not someone's logic is even remotely accurate. Now, Aristotle used and sometimes invented technical vocabulary in nearly all facets of his philosophy, which is why studying him is difficult. It is important to have an understanding of this vocabulary in order to understand his thought. In general, like Plato, Aristotle talked about forms, but not in the same way as his master. For Aristotle, forms without matter do not exist. I can contemplate the form of human being, but this would be impossible if actual human beings were non-existent. A particular human being, what Aristotle might call a this, is hylomorphic. a matter-hyle joined with form morphe. Similarly, we cannot sense or make sense of unformed matter. There is no matter in itself. Matter is the potential to take shape through form. Thus, Aristotle is often characterized as the philosopher of earth, while Plato's gaze is towards the heavens. As it appears in Raphael's famous school of Athens painting. Forms is thus both physical shape, but also the idea by which we best knew particular beings. Form is the actuality of matter, which is pure potentiality. Ew. Actuality and potentiality are important terms for Aristotle. A thing is in potentiality when it is not yet what it inherently or naturally become. An acorn is potentially an oak tree, but insofar as it is an acorn, it is not yet actually an oak tree. When it is an oak tree, it will have reached its actuality, its continuing activity of being a tree. The form of oak tree in this case informs the wood. Actuality, its continuing activity of being a tree. The form of oak tree in this case informs the wood, and gives it its shape. Makes it actually a tree, and not just a heap of matter. When a being is in actuality, it has fulfilled its end, its telos. All beings by nature are telic beings. The end of telos of an acorn is to become an oak tree. The acorn's potentiality is an inner striving towards its fulfillment. It is in actuality, or entelikeia, which is a word that Aristotle coined that is etymologically related to telos. It is the activity of being its own, and that actuality of this is also the ergon, or function or work of the oak tree. The best sort of oak tree, the healthiest, for example, best fulfills its work of function. It does this in its activity, its energeia of being. This activity, or energeia, is the in-working or being at work of the being. One more important set of technical terms is Aristotle's four causes: material, formal, efficient, and final cause. To know a thing thoroughly, it is to know the cause, atia, or what is responsible for making a being who or what it is. For instance, we might think of causes of a house. The material causes, the bricks, mortar, wood, and any other material that goes to make up the house. Yet these materials could not come together as a house without the formal cause that gives shape to it. A formal cause is the idea of the house and the architect's soul. The efficient cause would be the builders of the house. The final cause, that house exists in the first place, namely shelter, comfort, warmth, and so forth. So yeah, he's just sort of dealing with a very basic sort of causality. Basic to us now, but at the time this was fairly thought out and new. People frequently acted without thinking, mostly on habit. Believe it or not, acting on habit can get you through most of your life. This stuff, kind of thinking, is just to make those habits more excellent in their execution. It's complementary, and in some areas necessary. Now, Aristotle's psychology, which is his idea of the soul, is translated in Latin as de anima, and the Greek peripsyche gives us insight into Aristotle's conception of the composition of the soul. The soul is the actuality of a body. Alternatively, since matter is in potentiality and form is actuality, the soul is from the actuality of the body. Form and matter are never found separately from one another. Although we can make a logical distinction between them, for Aristotle, all living things are ensouled beings. Soul is the animating principle, or arche, of any living being, a self-nourishing, growing, and decaying being. Thus, even plants are ensouled. Without soul, a body would not be alive, and a plant, for instance, would be a plant in name only. There are three types of soul: nutritive, sensitive, and intellectual. Some beings have only one of these, or some mixture of them. If, however, a soul has the capacity for sensation, as animals do, then they also have a nutritive faculty. Likewise, for beings who have minds, they must also have the sensitive and nutritive faculties of soul. A plant has only the nutritive faculty of soul, which is responsible for nourishment and reproduction. Animals have sense perception in varying degrees and must also have the nutritive faculty, which allows them to survive. Human beings have intellect or mind, in addition to the other faculties of the soul. The soul is the source and the cause of the body in three ways: the source of motion, the telos, and the being or the essence of the body. The soul is the form which ultimately for which the body does what it does, and this includes sensation. Sensation is the ability to receive the form of an object without receiving its matter, much as the wax receives the form of the signet ring without receiving that the metal of which the ring is made. There are three types of sensible things. Particular sensibles are those qualities that can be sensed by one sense only. Common sensibles, which can be sensed by some combination of various senses, and incidental sensibles, as when I see my friend Tom, whose father is Joe. I say that I see the son of Joe, but I see Joe's son only. Incidentally, mind, as it was for Anaxagoras, is unmixed. Just as a sense received via the sense organ, the form of things but not the matter, mind receives the intelligible form of things without receiving the things themselves. More precisely, mind, which is nothing before it thinks and there is therefore itself when active, is isomorphic with what it thinks. The know something is most properly to know its form, and mind in some way becomes the form of what it thinks. Just how this happens is unclear, since the form is what is known. The mind receives or becomes that form when it best understands it. So mind is not a thing, but only the activity of thinking, and is particularly whatever it thinks in any given time. Yeah, very complex, very true. You basically are what you think about, you are what you do, and you are who you are with, arguably. Now, Aristotle's Ethics is very interesting. The most famous and thorough of Aristotle's ethical works is the Nicomachean Ethics. This work is an inquiry into the best life for human beings to live. The life of human flourishing and happiness, or eudaimonia, is the best life. It is important to note that we translate as happiness is quite different for Aristotle than it is for us. We often consider happiness to be a mood or an emotion, but Aristotle considers it to be an activity, a way of living one's life. Thus, it is possible for one to have an overall happy life, even if that life has its moments of sadness and pain. Happiness is the practice of virtue or excellence, and so it is important to know the types of virtue. Character virtue, the discussion of which makes up the bulk of the ethics, and the intellectual virtue. Character excellence comes about through habit. One habituates oneself to character excellence by knowingly practicing virtues. To be clear, it is possible to perform an excellent action accidentally or without knowledge, but doing so would not make for an excellent person, just as accidentally writing in a grammatically correct way does not make for a grammarian. One must be aware that one is practicing the life of virtue. Aristotle arrives at the idea that the vitality of the soul in accordance with virtue is the best life for human beings. Though the human function argument, if says Aristotle, human beings have a function or work, here in turn to ergon, to perform, then we can know that performing that function will result in the best sort of life. The work or function of an eye is to see and to see well. Thus each part of the body has a function, says Aristotle. So too must the human being as a whole have a function. This is an argument analogy. The function of the human being is logos, or reason, and the more thoroughly one lives the life of reason, the happier one's life will be. So yeah, we basically see a life in the practice of virtue. And Aristotle talks at length about the idea that that there is a sort of median, or the middle way, which is an avoidance of the excesses. Too much virtue or too little virtue. A common example is you're standing on a street and you see a woman walking by with her purse, and she's being mugged. An excess of virtue, excess of courage to the point of foolishness, you would try and face the thug, prevent the mugging, and then just get murdered. While a lack of courage or lack of virtue would result in you simply running away or letting it be. The middle way finds its way between the excesses. You summon a policeman. He tended to believe that this middle way had a kind of hidden truth within it that you would come to. But it is true. You know, I've lived my own life through the Aristotelian median, and he is absolutely right. There's something about being in that middle way that just feels correct. You see the results, you see the things around you, you know that some things are too extreme, while others are not extreme enough, you could say. He knows how to moderate. Too little drink, too little violence, too much violence, because sometimes violence is necessary in the response to violence. Total pacifism is basically apathy, and apathy is death. is what I would say about that. But he also talks to some length about what makes someone truly happy outside of virtue. Which is to say that friendship is also a necessary part of the happy life. There are three types of friendship, none of which is exclusive of the other. A friendship of excellence, a friendship of pleasure, and a friendship of utility. A friendship of excellence is based upon virtue, and each friend enjoys, and each friend contemplates the excellence of his or her friend. Since the friend is like another self, contemplating a friend's virtue will help us in the practice of virtue for ourselves. A mark of good friendship is that friends live together, that is, that friends spend a substantial amount of time together, since a substantial time apart will likely weaken the bond of friendship, also since the excellent persona has been habituated to a life of excellence. His or her character is generally firm and lasting. Likewise, the friendship of excellence is the last changeable and most lasting form of friendship. The friendship of pleasure and use are the most changeable forms of friendship, since the things we find pleasurable or useful tend to change over a lifetime. For example, if a friendship forms out of a mutual love of beer, but the interest of one of the friends later turns toward wine, the friendship would likely dissolve. Again, if a friend is merely one of utility, then the friendship will likely dissolve when it is no longer useful. Since the best life is a life of virtue or excellence, and since we are closer to the excellence, the more thoroughly we fulfill our function, the best life is the life of theoria, or contemplation. This is the most divine life, since one comes close to pure activity of thought. It is the most self-sufficient life, since one can think even when one is alone. What does one contemplate or theorize about? One contemplates one's knowledge of unchanging things. Some have criticized Aristotle, saying that this sort of life seems uninteresting, since we seem to enjoy the pursuit of knowledge more than just having knowledge. For Aristotle, however, the contemplation of unchanging things is an activity full of wonder. Now, this is the part of Aristotle's philosophy that is the most problematic, his politics. To some extent, there is some truth to it, but there's also some painful notions here. Now, the end for any individual human being is happiness, but human beings are naturally political animals, and thus belong in the polis, or city-state. Indeed, the inquiry into the good life of ethics belongs in the province of politics. Since a nation of polis determines what ought to be studied, any practical science which deals with everyday practical human affairs falls under the purview of politics. The last chapter of Nicomachean Ethics is dedicated to politics. Aristotle emphasizes that the goal of learning about the good life is not knowledge, but to become good, and he reiterates this in the final chapter. Since the practice of virtue is the goal of the individual, then ultimately we must turn our eyes to the arena in which this practice plays out, the polis. A good individual makes for a good citizen, and a good polis helps to engender good individuals. Legislators make the citizens good by forming habits in them, and this is the wish of every legislator. It is in this that a good constitution differs from a bad one. Laws must be instituted in such a way as it makes its citizens good. But the lawmakers must themselves be good in order to do this. Human beings are so naturally political that the relationship between the state and the individual is to some degree reciprocal. Without the state, the individual cannot be good. In the Politics, Aristotle says that a man who is so self-sufficient is to live away from a polis, is to make a beast, is like a beast or a god. That is, such a being is not a human being at all. Again, a man who is separated from law and justice is the worst of all. So basically, if you're living out in bushcraft land, you would say that you're either a beast or a god. In book 3.7 of the Politics, Aristotle categorizes 6 different political constitutions, naming 3 as good and 3 as bad. The 3 good constitutions are monarchy, which is ruled by one, aristocracy, ruled by the best, or aristos, and polity, ruled by the many. These are good because each has the common good as its goal. The worst constitutions, which parallel the best, are tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy, with democracy being the best of the 3 evils. These constitutions are bad because they have private interests in mind, rather than the common good or best interest of everyone. The tyrant has only his own good in mind. The oligarchs who open to be rich have their own interests in mind, and the people who happen not to be rich have only their own interests in mind. Yet Aristotle grants that there's a difference between an idea and a practicality, plausible constitution which depends upon how people actually are. The perfect state will be a monarchy or aristocracy, since they will be ruled by the truly excellent. Since, however, such a situation is unlikely when we face the reality of our current world, we must look at the next best, and the next best after that, and so on. Aristotle seems to favor democracy over, and after that, oligarchy. But he spends the bulk of his time explaining each of these constitutions actually takes many shapes. For example, there are farmer-based democracies, democracies based upon birth status, democracies in which all free men can participate in government, and so forth. Now, here's where we get to the problematic stuff. The male is by nature superior and the female inferior, and the one rules and the other is ruled. This principle of necessity extends to all mankind, where then there is such a difference that between soul and body, or between men and animals, the lower sort are by nature slaves, and it is better for them as for all inferiors that they should not be under the rule of a master. For he who can be, and therefore is, another's, and he who participates in reason enough to apprehend, but not to have, is a slave by nature. Whereas the lower animals cannot even apprehend reason, they obey their passions. Now keep in mind that in his time, slavery was very different. This was not whips and chains. A slave in ancient Greece was basically treated as a child. You had the rights of a child, you had the status of a child, you had a room in the house, you lived as a child, with one task assigned to you that you had to do every day, or you would be punished. Now, for Aristotle, women are naturally inferior to men, and there are those who are natural slaves. In both cases, it is a deficiency in reason that is the culprit. Women have reason but lack authority, and slaves have reason enough to take orders and have some understanding of their world, but cannot use reason as the best human being does. It is difficult, if not impossible, to interpret Aristotle charitably here. For slaves, one might suggest that Aristotle has in mind people who can only do mental tasks and nothing more. Yet there is a great danger even here. We cannot always trust the judgment of the master, who says that this or that person is capable of only menial tasks. Nor can we always know another person well enough to know what the scope of his or her capabilities for thought might be. So even a charitable interpretation of his views of slavery and women is elusive. Now here's the legacy most people love him for, which is physics. Now Aristotle's physics, which stood as the most influential study of physics until Newtonian physics, could be seen largely as a study of motion. Here's where we get into philosophical pre-science. Motion is defined in the physics as the actuality of the potentiality in the very way in which the thing in motion is in potentiality. Motion is not merely a change of place. It can also include processes changed in quality and quantity. For example, the growth of a plant from a rhizome to flower or quantity is a process of motion. Even though the flower does not have any obvious lateral change of place, the change of a light skin tone to a bronze via sun tanning is a qualitative motion. In any case, the thing in motion is not yet what it is becoming, but it is becoming, and thus is actually a potentiality qua potentiality. The light skin is not yet suntanned, but is becoming suntanned. This process of becoming is actual, that is, that the body is potentially tanned, and is actually in the process of this potentiality. So motion is the actuality of the potentiality of a being in the very way that it is a potentiality. Ah! Now, he also argues that the cosmos and its heavenly bodies are in perpetual motion, and it always has been. There could not have been a time with no motion. Whatever is moved by itself or by another, rest is simply a privation of motion. Thus, if there were a time without motion, then whatever existed, which had the power to cause motion in other beings, would have been at rest. If so, then it at some point had to have been in motion, since rest is the privation of motion. Motion then is eternal. What moves the cosmos? This must be the unmoved mover, or God. But God does not have the cosmos as an efficient cause, but as a final cause. That is, since all natural beings are telic, they must move toward perfection. What is the perfection of the cosmos? It must be eternal, perfect circular motion. It moves toward divinity. Thus the unmoved mover caused the cosmos to move forward in its own perfection. Yet another relatively secular, non-specific theological model for a god. Just like some of the other ones, this one or the Spinoza God, he's basically denying an infinite regress and saying that there is a first cause, which is uncaused. Now, Aristotle's metaphysics, legendarily known as such because it was literally categorized after his physics, was known to him as first philosophy, first in status but last in the order in which we should study his corpus. Now, it is arguably his most difficult work, which is due to its subject matter. This work explores the question of what being as being is, and it seeks knowledge of first causes, or ideal, and principles, archai. First causes and principles are indemonstrable, but all demonstrations proceed from them. They are something like the foundation of a building. The foundation rests upon nothing else, but everything else rests upon it. We can dig to the foundation, but let's pretend there's no earth beneath it. We can go no further. Likewise, we can reason our way up to the first principle and causes. But our reasoning and ability to know ends there. Thus we are dealing with an inherently difficult and murky subject. But once knowledge of the subject is gained, there is wisdom. So if philosophy is a constant pursuit of wisdom for Plato, Aristotle believed that the attainment of wisdom is possible. Aristotle says that there are many ways in which something is said to be, and this refers to the categories of being. We can talk about the substance of or being known as ousia of a thing, or what that thing actually essentially is. Quality, the shirt is red. Quantity, there are many people here. Action, he is walking. Passion, he is laughing. Relation, A is to B as B is to C. Place, she is in the room. Time, it is noon, and so on. We notice in each of these categories that being is at play. Thus, being considered qua being cannot be restricted to any one of the categories, but cuts across all of them. So what is being or substance? The form of a thing makes it intelligible rather than its matter, since things which relatively the same form can have different matter. Here we are really getting to the essence of something. Aristotle's phrase for essence is to ti en einai, which could be translated as what it is. To be, this or that thing, since nothing is what it is outside of matter. There is no form by itself, just as there is no pure matter by itself. The essence of anything, its very being, is its being as a whole. No particular being is identical with its quality, quantity, position in space, or any other identical features. It is the singular being as a whole. The this to which we can apply no further name that shows us that being in its being. And as we may note, Aristotle's God is always thinking. It is always moving, otherwise it is not alive. If it does not change, and it does not evolve, and it does not think, it dies. That is the thought of Aristotle. Now we move into some slightly smaller categories. This is the final study we are doing, which is Hellenistic thought. This is a very long video, and I apologize, but this is an important study. We are already a little bit over an hour. Now, Hellenistic thought. The Hellenistic period in philosophy is generally considered to have commenced with Alexander's death in 323 and ended approximately with the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. Although the Academy and the Lyceum could be considered in a thorough investigation into Hellenistic philosophy, scholars usually focus upon the Epicureans, Cynics, Stoics, and Skeptics. Now, Epicurus and his school are often mistakenly considered to be purely hedonistic, such that nowadays an epicure designates one who delights in fine foods and drinks. Etymologically, it is accurate to call Epicurus and his followers hedonists. We refer merely to pleasure without restricting that pleasure to bodily pleasures. Epicurus' school, which is Epicureanism, the garden which was an actual garden near Athens, was primarily friendly in nature and non-hierarchical. Although Epicurus was a prolific author, we have only 3 of his letters preserved in Diogenes Laertius Lives. Otherwise, we depend in large part on the Epicurean Lucretius and his work on the nature of things. Especially in order to understand Epicurean physics, which was essentially materialistic, the goal of all true understanding for Epicurus, which must involve the understanding of physics, was tranquility. Epicurus and his followers were thoroughgoing materialists. Everything except the void, even the human soul, is composed of material bodies. Epicureans were atomists and accordingly thought that here is nothing atoms and void. Atoms vary indefinitely in their shapes, for so many varieties of things as we could never have risen out of a recurrence of a definite number of the same shapes. Moreover, these atoms are always in motion and will remain in motion in the void until something can offer enough resistance to stop an atom in motion. Epicurus' view of atomic motion provides an important point of departure from a Democritean atomism. For Democritus, atoms move according to the laws of necessity, but for Epicurus, atoms sometimes swerve or venture away from their typical course, and this is due to chance. Chance allows room for free will. Epicureans seem to take for granted that there is a freedom of the will and then apply that assumption to their physics. That is, there seems to be the free will, so Epicureans then posit a physical explanation for it. So now we get into their ethics. Much of what we know about the Epicurean ethics comes from Epicurus, letter to Monosius, which is preserved in Diogenes Laertius Lives. The goal of the good life is tranquility or ataraxia. One achieves tranquility by seeking pleasure, hedon, but not just any pleasure will suffice. The primary sort of pleasure is the simplicity of being free from pain and fear. But even here we should not seek to be free from every sort of pain. We should pursue some painful things if we know that doing so will render great pleasure. In the end, so Epicurus, hedonism shapes up to be a nuanced hedonism. Indeed, he recommends a plain life, saying that the most enjoyment of luxury comes to those who need luxury least. Once we habituate ourselves to eating plain foods, for example, we gradually eliminate the pain of missing fancy foods, and we can enjoy the simplicity of bread and water. Epicurus explicitly denies that sensational pleasures constitute the best life, and argues that the life of reason, which includes the removal of erroneous beliefs that cause us pain, will bring us peace and tranquility. Whew! He often states, Epicurus, that false belief is painful to us because it brings us pain through, that is to say, Epicurus would encourage us to anthropomorphize the gods and think only what is fitting for the most blessed eternal beings. We are not thinking clearly when we think that the gods get angry with us or care about all our personal affairs. It is not befitting of an eternal and blessed being to become angry over or involved in the affairs of mortals. So things like, say, the fear of hell. False beliefs that make us suffer. Only the truth should make us suffer, and then we should bear with it, essentially. Now, perhaps Epicurus is anthropomorphizing here. This argument seems to rely on his argument that tranquility is our greatest pleasure, and upon the assumption that the gods must experience that pleasure. On the other hand, one could read Epicurus as a sort of proto-negative theologian, who merely suggests that it is unreasonable to believe that gods, the best of beings, feel pain at all. Now, he also states that we should not fear death because death is nothing to us. For good and evil imply sentience, and death is the privation of all sentience. The key here is the first premise that good and evil apply only to us, sentient beings. We recall that for Epicurus, we are thoroughly material beings. Both mind and soul are part of the human body. And the human body is nothing if not sentient. Therefore, when the body dies, so too does the mind and soul. And so does the sentience. This means that death is literally nothing to us. The terror we feel about death now will vanish when we die. So we need to abandon the fear of death so that we can achieve our tranquility, as well as many of the other things pointed out. Now here are some gross dudes called the Cynics, okay? The Cynics were similar to the Epicureans, but were not a proper philosophical school. They did not establish anything. In fact, they didn't believe in establishments. The identifiable characteristics of cynical thought. I heard something. Anyway, they were termed as such by non-cynics, or both. The first of the dogs. Antisthenes was supposedly close to Socrates and was present at his death, according to Plato, Phaedo, yet it was Diogenes of Sinope, often called simply Diogenes the Cynic, who was and is the most famous of the dogs. Most information we have comes from Diogenes Laertius Lives, which is written centuries after Diogenes the Cynic's life and is therefore historically problematic. But yes, we know quite a bit about Diogenes. We know, for one, a little sweaty, We know for one that Diogenes, he lived in a barrel at the side of a stairwell. He wore barely anything, and he sometimes threw stuff at people. He made fun of people, he mocked people, and these shenanigans, often disgusting shenanigans, were primarily designed to try and get people to see the flaws in everyday Greek society. He defaced coins, which got him thrown out of Sinope. He defaced the city coins, using it as a metaphor for throwing away the false coin of conventional wisdom, for the wisdom that would be acquired of living the way nature had intended, as an animal. Naked as the day you were born, or wearing barely anything. He also went around with a torch, going to various Greek people saying he was looking for a human being, saying that no one in Greece could be truly called a human being, that the idea of the human being does not exist, that it is just an animal. He was a pretty disgusting fellow, but he did have some good points here and there. But yeah, he threw stuff at people, he insulted people. There's even a famous story where he met Alexander the Great, because Alexander had heard the stories of this insane wild man, and he came to visit, and then he was all like, and when he came there, Diogenes literally told Alexander, get the hell out of my sun, because he was suntanning, and he was blocking his sunlight. He was enjoying the sun, and he blocked his sun. He told Alexander the Great, get out of my sun. Damn, that takes some balls. Alexander apparently, upon the meeting, loved him to death, saying that if he were not Alexander, he would want to be Diogenes. So we see how insane this guy was. He was just wacky. Now, something that evolved from cynicism is a philosophy that I tend to subscribe to, is the Stoics. Stoicism, which evolved from cynicism but was more doctrinal focused and organized. While the Cynics largely ignored typical fields of study, the Stoics embraced physics, logic, and ethics, making strides especially in logic. Zeno of Citium was the founder of the Stoic school, which was named after the Stoa Poikile, a painted portico where the Stoics regularly met, which was the beginning of a long and powerful tradition which lasted into the imperial era. Now, Epicurean physics, as Pierre Hadot has shown, the Stoics studied physics in order to better understand their own lives, and to live better lives. Stoic physics was indispensable for ethics because it showed people that there are some things which are not in their power but depend on causes external to them. Causes which are linked in a necessary, rational manner, like the Cynics. The Stoics strove to live in accordance with nature, and so a righteous study of nature allowed them to do so all the more effectively. The Stoics were materialists, though not thoroughgoing materialists as the Epicureans were. Also, chance can play no role in the Stoics' ordered and thoroughly rational and causally determined universe. Since we are part of this universe, our lives too are causally determined, and everything in the universe teleologically oriented towards it. It's rational fulfillment. Diogenes Laertius reports that the Stoics saw matter as passive and logos as active, and the gods run through all the matter as its organizing principle. This divinity is most apparent in us via our ability to reason. At any rate, the universe is, as the name implies, a unity, and it is divine. Stoic epistemology, the idea that we have of the world, the knowledge we have of the world, comes directly through our senses and impresses itself upon the blank slate of our minds. The naked information that comes to us via the senses allows us to know objects, but our judgments of these objects can lead us into error. As Hadot says about these so-called objective presentations, Hadoken! they do not depend on our will. Rather, our inner discourse enunciates and describes their content, and we either give or withhold our consent from this enunciation. There might be a problem lurking here regarding the standard of truth, which for the Stoics is simply the correspondence of our description of the object. which the actual object can bring us knowledge, can we even be sure that our descriptions really match the object? After all, if it is not the bare sense impression that brings knowledge, but my correct description of the object, it seems that there is no standard by which I can ever be sure that my description is correct. So essentially, we're talking about a kind of, well, anyway, that reality is a projection. And that we can only describe what we see, not the actual object itself necessarily. Now, Stoic ethics. Stoic ethics urges us to be rid of our desires and aversions, especially where their desires and aversions are not in accord with nature. For instance, death is natural. To be averse to death will bring misery. Stoic ethics can perhaps be best summed up in the first paragraph of Epictetus' handbook, or Epictetus. Some things are up to us and some are not up to us. Our opinions and our impulses, desires, aversions, in short, whatever is our own doing, our bodies are not up to us, nor are our possessions or reputations, or our public offices, or that is, whatever is not our own doing. The things that are up to us are by nature free, unhindered, and unimpeded. The things that are not up to us are weak, enslaved, hindered, not our own. If you think that only what is yours, and that what is not is yours is not your one, is not your own, then no one will ever coerce you, no one will hinder you, you will blame no one, you have no enemies, and no one will harm you because you will not be harmed at all. In other words, if you learn to live with the things that you can't help, then they will become of no consequence. You will basically be like wearing a suit of armor. Now, this passage might be shocking to us today, when especially in the United States, many of the things that Epictetus tells us to avoid are what we are told to pursue. We therefore might wonder why our bodies, possessions, reputations, wealth, or jobs are not in our control. For Epictetus, it is simple: possession, come and go. They can be destroyed, lost, stolen, and so forth. Reputations are determined by others, and it is reasonable to believe that even the best people will be hated by some, and even the worst people will be loved by some. Try as we might never gain wealth, and even if we do, it can be lost, destroyed, or stolen. Again, public office, like reputation, is up to others to determine. So the adage that you can be anything you want in life is not only false under Stoic ethics, but dangerous, misleading, since it will almost inevitably lead to misery. Now, there is the question of whether or not you can be sure you'll ever be harmed, even if I truly grant that someone who, for instance, pushes me down a flight of stairs has committed his own wrong, and that his wrong actions are not in my control. Will I not still feel pain? Physical pain for a Stoic is not harm. The only real harm is when one harms oneself by doing evil, just as the only real good is living excellently and in accordance with reason in this example. I would harm myself with the judgment that what happened to me was bad. One might object here as one might object to cynicism, that Stoic ethics ultimately demands repression of what is most human about us. Indeed, Epictetus says, if you kiss your child or wife, say that you are kissing a human being. For when it dies, you will not be upset. For the Stoic, being moved by others brings us away from tranquility. However, kissing a human being is not the same as kissing this human being, this individual who would be deeply hurt by knowing what I treat them merely as a human being, and who I relate to only through a sense of duty rather than a real sense of love. Stoic ethics risks removing our humanity from us in favor of its own notion of divinity. Notion of divinity. Now, on to the skeptics, which is the final school to look at, and then we're done. Good grief. The two strands of skepticism in the Hellenistic era were academic skepticism and Pyrrhonian skepticism. Someone like the Cynics, each major skeptic had his own take on skepticism, so it is difficult to lump them all under a tidy label. Also, like the Cynics, however, there are certain characteristics that can be highlighted. Despite differences between particular thinkers, skepsis means inquiry about the skeptics. Did not seek knowledge or absolute answers as the goal of their inquiry. Rather, the goal of their skepsis was tranquility and freedom from judgments. Opinions are absolute claims to knowledge. Skepticism, broadly speaking, constituted a challenge to the possibility and the nature of knowledge. So we will look at academic skepticism. The sixth scholarch of Plato's Academy was Arcelius, who initiated a substantial tradition of skepticism in the Academy that lasted into the 1st century. Arcelius found the inspiration of his skepticism in the figure of Socrates. Arcelius would argue both for and against any given position, ultimately showing that neither side of the argument can be trusted. He directed his skepticism partially toward the Stoics and the empirical basis of their claims to knowledge. We recall that for the Stoics, a grasping sense of impressions in the proper way is the true foundation for knowledge. Arcelius' arguments against Stoic empiricism is not clear. The argument is recounted in Cicero's Academia, but it seems ultimately to reach the conclusion suggested above, namely that we can never be sure that the way we have perceived an object via the senses is true or false. The argument runs roughly as follows. For any given presentation of an object to the senses, we can imagine that something else could be presented to the senses in just the same way, such that the perceiver cannot distinguish between the two objects being presented, which Arcelius thought the Stoics would grant. The perceiver can present these objects to himself or herself via the senses in a true-false way, which the Stoics would also grant. It is possible then that the perceiver thinks one presentation is true and the other is false, but he has no way of distinguishing between either. Arcelius' conclusion is that we should always suspend our judgment. So yeah, there's the academic approach, and the 10th scholar of Plato's Academy seems to have clearly answered a typical objection raised against skepticism, which is that it is inconsistent. And it goes against the objection to insist that it is impossible for anything to be known, since that statement, nothing can be known, is itself a claim to knowledge. So yeah, that's a pretty big flaw in the skeptic line of thinking. Now, here is the Pyrrhonian skepticism, which we know almost nothing for sure about Pyrrho or of Elis, but they wrote nothing. So that is perhaps a sign of his extreme skepticism. That is, if we cannot know anything or cannot be sure whether knowledge is possible, then nothing can definitely be said, especially in writing. So perhaps the most differentiates Pyrrhonian skepticism from academic skepticism is the profound indifference that Pyrrhonian skepticism is meant to generate. Diogenes Laertius relays the story that when his master Anaxarchus had fallen into a swamp, Pyrrho simply passed him by, and was later praised by Anaxarchus for his supreme indifference. Pyrrhonian skepticism refutes all dogmas and opinions and vehemently clings to interdeterminacy, the idea that nothing can be known. And so you let a guy fucking drown in the swamp. That's... Anyway, skepticism is kind of sick. I hate it. But Anicedemus, the Pyrrhonian skeptic, advanced the 10 modes argument that address typical difficulties in appearance and judgment, each aimed toward the conclusion that we ought to suspend judgment if we are to be at peace. The first mode argues that other animals sense things differently from human beings, and that we cannot therefore pretend to place any absolute value on the things sensed. Since the qualities of sensation vary from species to species, for example, the quail thrives on hemlock, which is fatal to man. We ought to suspend value judgments upon those things in the example. Then the hemlock clearly is not in of itself evil, but neither is in itself good, but is a matter of indifference. The remaining modes follow a similar pattern, highlighting relativity, whether cultural, personal, sensory, qualitative, or quantitative, as evidence that we ought to suspend judgment. Pierre Hadot says use of philosophical discourse to eliminate philosophical discourse was the skeptic way, and that is they do not adhere to any philosophical position but use the tools of philosophy to gain a sense of simplicity and tranquility in life, thereby ridding themselves of the need for philosophy by using dialectic and opposing one argument to another. The skeptic suspends judgment and is not committed to any particular position. The skeptic, as everything he did was to limit himself to describing what he experienced without adding anything about what things are or what they are worth. He was to be content to describe the sensory representations he had and to enunciate the state of sensory apparatus without adding to its opinion. So we might wonder just how practical such an approach to life would be. Can we flourish or thrive effectively, communicate, or find cures for diseases by merely describing our experience of the world? For example, antibiotics can help more often than not to cure diseases born from certain bacteria. Can we not say for practical purposes that we know this to be the case? We are not, after all, ignorant of the fact that bacteria are becoming resistant to certain antibiotics. Excuse me. This does not mean that they do not work or that we cannot someday find alternative cures for practical infections. Now, the skeptic could reply, medicine does not bring us knowledge if knowledge is certainty. Medicine and what it claims to know has, after all, changed significantly. The practice of medicine is just another way of describing the way certain bodies interact with other bodies in a given time and place. But the skeptic would go further. The curing of a disease, he would say, is neither good nor bad. Perhaps my disease is cured and the next day I am killed some other way. If death is a matter of indifference, then the cure for illness must be too. Again, we might wonder in this case how one is ever spurred to action. I think skepticism in its original conception is utterly disgusting. Modern skepticism makes more sense. That one is skeptical of an idea until one has reason to accept or believe in it. That is a much more acceptable view. Skepticism is truly sick. The insane indifference to meaning. It sickens me. But yes, this was the first pillar of Western civilization in detail. These schools of thought form the basis of the modern thought we have now. The rules of debate, the rules of logic, the laws of logic, laws of motion, all that. And it helped spawn science through Neoplatonism, as well as some of the Roman philosophers. So there you have it. This is the first pillar. It's extremely crucial, and it's important to understand where these ideas come from. Needless to say, these men in togas, for their time, were genius. Anyway, down below will be the link to my books. Please buy and download them and read them. Thank you. Sorry for the long video. Welcome to the revolution.